Hey to all you listeners, thank you for checking out this new show. I am beyond stoked to welcome you to the first ever episode of What It's Like, a brand new podcast hosted by yours truly, Tash, and brought to you by DSS Productions and Studio Under the Stairs. It is truly an honor to have your audible attention, and I really hope that you enjoy what's ahead. I've been tossing around the idea of starting a solo project for a while now, and it's always been centered around honing in on a single episodic topic and combining the research and facts with personal experience. Literally, you guys, from my own mouth, no topics are off limits for this show. This is really about opening up and creating an honest place for people to relate to one another and form a community of connections. This, of course, means that I'll be looking to collaborate in the future, either hosting guests on the show or reading your anonymous or personal anecdotes on air. So if you have something that you're simply dying to get off your chest or that you'd like me to explore further on your behalf, please get in touch. You can email me at flannelonflannelwithtosh@gmail.com or send me a direct message through Instagram at catharsis.on.canvas. Please also be sure to like, follow, subscribe, share, all that other good stuff. I appreciate the time that you're dedicating to listen to this content, and I hope to hear from you. So without further ado, let's get down to it. Today, we're going to be talking about what it's like to suffer from a phobia or an irrational fear. Not only are we going to be exploring the scientific and neurological development of such a condition, but you can also bet your bottom dollar that I'm going to be sharing one of my own phobias, which I used to mistake for hydrophobia, which is the fear of water. So if you're ready, let's take a deep dive into today's subject matter, no pun intended. So aside from hearing about phobias from our overdramatic or hypochondriac friends, what exactly gets conjured up in our minds when we hear that word, phobia? Take a moment now to think about it. Breathe. Yes, thinking hard. Keep thinking harder, but please don't get scared by thinking too hard about it. Otherwise, I'm going to have to insert a trigger warning here. Okay, so in my brain, a phobia equals the ultimate fear. It can be incredibly crippling, and because we know it to be basically fear on steroids, I also automatically think about common or shared fears such as spiders and holes. Yes, I said holes. Have you ever seen those weird plants that are full of hole clusters, like all really close together? I get goosebumps just thinking about photos of these plants. It's so gross. Unsurprisingly, within the top 10 phobias, according to anxietyhouse.com, we see arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders. That's a no-brainer, but I still think I should get a point for naming that one. Agoraphobia, which I always thought was the fear of the outdoors. Thank you to Nick Swardson's albino character from the movie Benchwarmers, a classic. But it's actually defined as the fear of situations which are difficult to escape from. This could be anything from open spaces to crowded areas, etc. There's also cynophobia, which is the fear of dogs. I'm thankful I don't have this, or I'd have to get rid of my Pomeranian. And mysophobia, which is the fear of dirt and germs, which I also can't imagine having because it would make it extremely hard to satisfy my daily OCD. And I'm sorry to all those who have witnessed this and who can tolerate my crazy behavior. If we look more closely at the literal definition of the word phobia, we're working with this: an excessive or irrational feeling evoking also dread, panic, and anxiety. It can be disabling, and what's worse is that even though you yourself recognize that the fear is absurd, it doesn't mean that you're mentally able to overcome it. Similarly to what we've done with sociopaths and psychopaths and the entire antisocial personality disorder spectrum, phobias can also be caused by either genetic or environmental circumstances, or even a combination of the two. Think back to one of the first things that ever scared you. Now, does it still bother you? And if so, does it bother you to the extreme? My first fear was E.T. the extraterrestrial from the Spielberg film, and I still haven't been able to watch that movie since I was about 5 years old. But since we can't predict what will frighten us as children, it doesn't leave much room for avoiding the development of a phobia. A shit ton of people have at least one irrational fear, and it's likely that they will suffer from this fear indefinitely, even for the rest of their lives. The whole face your fear strategy doesn't always work so well. So once this irrational fear subject has been identified or conditioned in the brain, it's quite interesting as the imagined threat actually becomes more debilitating than the physical threat itself. This is, after all, a mental disorder, and it demonstrates just how powerful the human brain truly is. When a person is confronted with the phobia subject, it can cause all kinds of unfavorable reactions, such as a panic attack. Now, according to the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, there are 3 identified types of phobias. I want to break those down for you. The first is a specific phobia, which is an intense irrational fear of a specific trigger, for example, spiders. This is also known as a simple phobia, as a trigger is completely identifiable and possibly unavoidable. The less frequent, the more easily it is to control. The second is social phobia or social anxiety. This is a profound fear of public humiliation or being singled out amongst others. Now, please don't confuse this with shyness. I know myself, and I can overcome shyness and become the life of the party quite quickly, so it's definitely not the same thing. And the third is agoraphobia. So we're back to gone full circle. This, once again, is the fear of not being able to escape, and it's much more in-depth than I ever thought. I actually believe a lot of people I know could suffer from this. The second 2 phobias on this list are considered complex phobias, not only because the trigger isn't always the same when in situational terms, but it's also based on many other components that are out of a person's control. Regardless of the phobia type, this mental disorder can be officially diagnosed when a person starts organizing their life around said trigger, or when they resort to complete avoidance altogether. And ironically, that might be one of the biggest fears that we face as humans in the modern Western world. Not having control or say over our basic day-to-day activities, this entire concept can truly become a luxury. Now, if up to this point in the episode, you're still unsure as to whether or not you have a phobia, then I'd like to break down the physical symptoms for you, which would be uncontrollable anxiety when confronted with fear, need for avoidance, lack of basic functions, inability to control rationality. Additionally, physically, you would suffer from sweating, abnormal breathing, accelerated heartbeat, trembling, chills, choking, chest pains, pins and needles, dry mouth, confusion, nausea, dizziness, and headache. Now, these might seem rather generic, but I do believe that if you've ever experienced these symptoms in combination, you would totally recognize the feeling. Being able to understand or control your bodily reactions to a simple phobia, especially, is a very distinct and discernible reaction. Another very interesting point that I discovered during my research is that phobias can be developed for literally anything. And what's even more unsettling is that as our culture inevitably progresses, phobias will continue to form for totally new things all the time. Everything is a threat. Like, holy shit, did you know that there's a phobia for being without a cell phone? It's called Nomophobia, which is hilarious when you think about it. It sounds like no mo phone, or nomophobia altogether. Is this because it's the ultimate phobia? Nomophobia. And I don't think you'll ever forget this one now. Maybe it'll end up replacing the fear of spiders pretty soon at the top of the phobia list. To be honest, at this point in time, I'm surprised it's not already there. Now, I can actually attest to this fear, not full-blown phobia level, but I did get a small taste of this semi-recently when all the Rogers cell service and internet service went down in my area. Actually, it happened in most of Canada. I cannot explain how jarring and overwhelmingly stressful it was to look at my personal phone and my work phone and my mobile internet and have zero connection to the outside world. For the first time since receiving my iPhone in the mail, it felt like a useless brick in my hands, and I understood what true isolation was like. Now, thankfully, many of us in Canada were on the same page that day, but damn, as if COVID couldn't make us feel more fear or make us feel more alone. It felt like a sample of the zombie apocalypse, and I don't know if I'll make it. Now, this brings me to the next point, the brain activity aspect during a phobia reaction. Did you know that the brain stores dangerous and deadly events as memories? In all honesty, this totally makes sense from a survival instinct perspective, to protect yourself from an honest threat. But the brain won't always discern from what's truly rational or irrational. So when you do feel that phobia or trigger response, your brain is drawing on these past events, and it causes you to experience these symptoms again and again and again. Even at inappropriate times, your brain will continue to retrieve that stress and let it affect your entire body. How truly frightening is that? It's actually out of our control. But back to the basics, like most mental disorders, phobias will form during childhood or young adulthood. So if you are over the age of 30, which for the first time I'm thankful to be, hallelujah, and you've been in the clear so far, it's pretty likely that you won't be developing a phobia now. Lucky you. Now, at the start of the episode, I mentioned that I had a phobia of my own. So am I able to pinpoint the event or the pivotal moment where my phobia began? There has been a kind of evolution to it, which I find interesting. So I like to draw on my own experiences now and assess the development of this irrational fear throughout my own early childhood and young adult life in order to support the research up to this point. Now, at a certain time, I assumed that this irrational fear of mine was hydrophobia, which I mentioned is the fear of water. But it definitely goes a bit deeper than that, and it certainly is not as literal. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be able to have a shower every single day, or I'd be hesitant to consume lots of beverages. And that sounds awful. I might have blocked out some of this memory from my childhood, but I've heard the story a ton of times. Apparently, I had a death wish when I was around 3 years old, as it seems like many of us do when we get into stupid amounts of trouble at this age. It's a time when we need our parents most to protect us. This isn't morbid, it's just fact and human behavior. But when my parents were still together, we lived in this beautiful house with a huge backyard. We spent the whole summer with our older neighbors, and they had a gorgeous in-ground pool. It was like being in an actual paradise during the warm months of the year. Now, their backyard was obviously fenced in, but one summer afternoon, just my dad and I were supposed to go over for a swim. Clearly, at such a young age, I would have needed water wings or some sort of flotation device to be safe. I guess I had gotten tired of waiting for my dad to get ready, so I left the house and went to my neighbor's backyard alone. I unfortunately knew how to open the gate by myself, and no one else was around at the time. I was wearing my dad's giant blue t-shirt to protect my skin from the sun, and I guess I made my way over to the pool and just dropped in without a second thought. As you can imagine, I sunk right to the bottom, and it may have been in the shallow end, but I wasn't tall enough to reach the surface to breathe, nor did I know how to get my body above the water. I'm not entirely sure how long I was down there for, but my dad was thankfully not too far behind me. He jumped into the water and he rescued me. My hero. If anything, I imagine that this experience was probably more traumatic for him than it was for me, but I'm so grateful that he saved my life, obviously. Now, that experience alone wasn't enough to deter me from being in pool water altogether. But when I was about 10 or 11 years old, something happened that made me want to stop swimming in lakes and oceans for good. Both sides of my family grew up right on Lake Erie, and going to the beach was a huge part of growing up in that area. My granny and grandpa lived in a little town called Port Ryerson, and I used to go for sleepovers there all the time at the farmhouse with my older cousins. Now, one night, against my better judgment, I ended up watching the entire movie Jaws on cable TV, and I have to admit that it overwhelmed me a lot. Perhaps not your typical horror film, but it was more than enough for me. I was mesmerized from the very first scene, and I even stayed up past my bedtime to finish it with my cousin. I'm sure that I was more afraid to admit my fear than to ask her to shut it off, but the fear of sharks didn't immediately set in that night. I felt it start to grow over the summer that followed, and even the next day when I woke up. I've always found that fears often evolve after a horror movie marathon sleepover, when you get back to normal life the day after. I didn't express my feelings to anyone about the sharks, as I've always been pretty private about that stuff, but I couldn't wrap my head around why it was such a big deal. During summers, ever since I was really, really young, I always would take swimming lessons. And at that time, being in pool water definitely didn't concern me as much as the lake did. But what I did think really interesting, or what I do think is really interesting, is that my fears of water and sharks as an all-encompassing phobia didn't start to grow rapidly until I hit puberty. Now, this episode is intended to be as raw and as honest as possible, so I'm prepared to share this important piece of information with you, my audience, as I know that it's the most authentic thing I can do. This irrational fear or phobia of sharks was somewhat on the back burner until the summer I turned 13. I remember wearing a two-piece bathing suit to my swimming lesson for the very first time, and since I was at the level closest to becoming a lifeguard, we started the session in the deep end. I distinctly recall diving into the pool and feeling the water against my exposed torso. It was the first time that I had been at a lesson in the pool since my body had started developing, and being in this weird and somewhat foreign physical and emotional state made me hyper-conscious of everything that was happening during those moments. It was an immediate discomfort for me, as if it felt like I was doing something wrong. My instructor asked me to start back crawl laps of the pool, and as soon as I got on my back to start, all I could think about was the opening scene of Jaws. For real, you guys, it smacked me in the face. Those familiar movements and the situation itself being so similar to the movie. Trying to make sense of my feelings now, I would say that I felt these things because I was newly a teenager. My hormones were racing off the charts, and it was as though I was inappropriately dressed, an almost unsuspecting female victim. It reminded me of Chrissy's last swim, which is the name of scene 1 in Jaws. Even that iconic movie poster with the enormous shark swimming beneath the naked woman. I studied film theory when I was in university, and I think back to this scene all the time for the whole pain for pleasure theory that centers around specifically female characters. Chrissy is punished for luring a boy into the water, taking off her clothes, and for being provocative in general. But the boy is not punished. It's not just because they needed someone to survive and relay the details to the authorities the next day. It is purposefully the woman who dies. I think that's what I felt in this moment too, without even realizing the film theory or the connection behind it. I remember being on my back, and I started to panic. I even asked my instructor if I could do a different kind of stroke for my laps. I recall my legs stiffening up and my stomach clenching. I had goosebumps and chills all over my body, generally just out of control. Even trying to get back into the headspace now to recall the details, I can feel my toes start to curl a bit and my feet cramp. It's this physical discomfort that comes over me while the fear consumes my mind at the same time. It was like even with my eyes open or closed, I could totally see the shark approaching from beneath. It was inevitable. Like even though I was in a public pool with chlorine, with clear water, with plenty of people around, and no possible way that a shark attack could ever happen, but I was convinced that it was. And I could imagine feeling the tip of the shark's nose against me just before the teeth would sink in and rip apart my flesh. Of course, meaning that it would be too late at this point to do anything about it. I felt truly vulnerable in that moment. I had to avoid the issue altogether, but it felt like it was out of my control. To be honest, I can't even remember if I finished that swimming course. but I do know that it was the last one I ever ended up taking. The general discomfort of becoming a woman definitely triggered this phobia for me, or at least took it to that level. And I avoided being in water for years and years after that. While we may be aware that certain sharks do pose a threat to humans and we should be wary of them, phobias have this way of taking general fear to the next level. For your information, if you're interested, the phobia of sharks is called Galeophobia. And I really enjoyed the earlier point that even though we are aware that what we are thinking and fearing is so ridiculous, we will also simultaneously feel powerless in the situation. We surrender to the phobia because we believe that there is no way to combat it. We give it our power because our minds can be our own worst enemy. I will say that I tried the face your fears tactic in my early 20s, so don't judge me too harshly for giving up on enjoying summer months. I went on a super organized camping trip with my boyfriend at the time and our two best friends. There was a ton of water activities that you could participate in, obviously, and I knew that I would probably have to face my fears at some point, but I was prepared to suffer the consequences. It would be better than admitting the truth to these people, even if I did trust them not to judge me. I remember on one of the first days we were there, we took a tour of a local museum which had a model of a 10 to 15 foot freshwater fish allegedly at the bottom of the surrounding bay. The image of that shark-like creature burned itself into my mind, but I tried to stay rational and think about the tiny likelihood of encountering such a specimen during this trip. On one of the last days, we took our canoes out to a huge rock formation. I remember it being so beautiful when I was in the canoe, but the water was completely jet black. It's not something that I had seen before. My friends made sure that the bottom of the bay was deep enough, and we climbed to the top of a 30 to 40 foot rock and started taking turns jumping off of it. Of course, I waited anxiously for my turn. I didn't want to disappoint everyone, but I was low-key freaking out inside. Against my better judgment, I closed my eyes and I jumped. On my way down, I recall thinking about that giant-ass fish and sharks and deep black water with no bottom. I hit the water and I inhaled too late. When I was under the water, I tucked my legs up to my body and avoided touching anything below me. When I got back up to the surface, I was gasping and my legs went totally stiff again, just like they did in the pool. I remember thinking that I had no idea what was underneath me. I was waiting there for this impending doom, this bite, this grazing against my foot, this feeling that this moment was going to be my last moment ever. It was the strangest thing. I felt totally paralyzed. Now that would be my last experience in open fresh water. And since then, I've continued to test my fears about sharks and open/uncertain areas. I've looked at plenty of photos of great white sharks, and no, not in a fetishy way. And I've even tried watching some mediocre shark movies with really bad CGI to prove to myself just how unrealistic it is to be scared. And I do feel a little less terrified, but it's still nothing compared to being in the water physically. So I will say that it is possible to overcome some elements of a phobia. I mean, I do have to avoid Shark Week every year, even though I know it's an incredible program that people get totally stoked about. Part of me is dying to just take the plunge and binge watch it, but I'm still not sure. I've since also spent a decent amount of time in pools and certainly don't think about constantly Chrissy's last swim when I'm under the water. In all honesty, I guess this phobia is a bit more difficult to classify than I thought it would be. I'm not sure if I fit into one box, but I definitely know that what I felt since a young age is not totally normal, and my irrational fears are certainly a product of my environment and my upbringing. I'm sure we all know someone who suffers pretty badly from a phobia. I know several people who are petrified of snakes, but one of my best friends in high school had a serious phobia of them. She was so terrified of snakes to the point where you couldn't even say the word when she was in earshot. This poor girl was a die-hard Harry Potter fan too, and I think she had to walk out of the theater during the Chamber of Secrets film because of that damn basilisk. Since where we grew up doesn't have many native snake species to the area, at least not ones that are dangerous, I never took the time to ask her how and why she was so scared. But I do respect her for being so forthcoming about it. It's definitely not easy to admit when something like that has control over your life in some way. And this concept of vulnerability comes into play again, because once someone knows what your ultimate fear is, what stops them from using it against you? It's a lot like Stephen King's concept of it, or Pennywise. Anyways, the point is that it's okay to own your fears and or your phobias. We might not be able to make sense of them with each other or rationalize them, but the fact is that we all suffer from something that's a little bit strange or unsettling. In terms of voluntary treatment, this really exists in the mind. You can do some mental practices to condition yourself to be more in control. You can imagine yourself as not being afraid. You can try mental or literal confrontation, but this all really comes down to the person who has the phobia. If you want to be more accepting of someone who suffers from an irrational fear, try to be understanding as best you can and take it seriously. When appropriate, challenge the negative thoughts, but therapy is definitely a good route to take if you're finding that it's completely taking over your life or someone you know. My biggest hope is that you've learned something valuable from this episode and that maybe you can relate to my experiences or feelings about phobias. I know I'm not the only one out there, and it feels pretty damn good to have gotten this off my chest. Thank you for listening. I'm really looking forward to putting together more content for you. And if you have any suggestions at all for what I should tap into next, please reach out. Guest spots are open and recommendations are always welcome. As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you can email me at flannelonflannelwithtosh@gmail.com or send me a direct message through Instagram at catharsis.on.canvas. And check out DSS Productions and the list of our incredible shows, starting from scratch, #Dick Smoothie with Daniel and Tash, and Flannel on Flannel with Daniel. You can also listen to all of our shows on a ton of podcast platforms and check out the Flannel on Flannel with Daniel YouTube channel. That was a mouthful. I would love nothing more than to even hear from you regarding your own phobias or irrational fears and what kind of advice you might have to share with the fellow listeners. Together, we are stronger. Once again, please also be sure to like, follow, subscribe, share, etc. if you have enjoyed the episode. Thank you again so much for lending me your ears. I hope that you have a stellar day or night. This is Tosh signing off.